The lantern on the windowsill was burning low when Theodora Underwood pressed her back against the cold plank wall of the sheriff's office and let out a sound that was not quite a sob and not quite a scream, but something that lived in the desperate space between both. The paper in her hand shook with the trembling of her fingers, and the ink on it, her husband's handwriting, unmistakable even now, confirmed every dark suspicion she had buried beneath 2 years of trying to believe in something good. He had never owned the land. The deed was forged. The ranch she had crossed 600 miles of dusty, unforgiving territory to build her life upon was never his to give her, never his to promise, and the man she had married in a Springfield parlor 14 months ago had known it from the very first moment he pressed her hand and said, "I have built you a kingdom, Theodora." There was no kingdom. There was only debt, deception, and now, a freshly dug grave outside of town with her husband in it. The door to the sheriff's office creaked open, and Andrew Walden stepped through it. He was not a big man in the way that frontier towns produced big men. He was not barrel-chested or loud with it, but he was solid, the kind of solid that came from 20 years of working land that did not want to be worked, and his eyes, dark as creek water after a storm, moved across the room and landed on her with an expression she had never seen from a stranger before. It was not pity. She would have thrown the lantern at pity. It was witness. He simply saw her entirely. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not say he was sorry for her loss. He did not reach for her or speak or try to fill the terrible silence with the well-meaning noise that everyone else in Harlan Creek had offered her all day like coins dropped into a beggar's cup. He simply pulled the chair from beside the deputy's empty desk, set it 3 feet from where she stood against the wall, and sat down in it. She stared at him. He looked at the lantern. And that was how it began. To understand what that moment meant, you have to understand what Harlan Creek, Colorado looked like in the autumn of 1883, and what it had already cost Theodora Underwood to arrive at that particular wall in that particular room on that particular night. Harlan Creek was not a beautiful town by any reasonable measure. It sat in a shallow valley where the Cimarron Range made its final argument before giving way to the flat eastern plain, and the wind that came through the gap between Carpenter Ridge and the long brown shoulder of Sentinel Mesa was the kind of wind that had opinions. It bent the cottonwoods sideways. It stole hats and carried off the occasional chicken. It filled every crack in every building and reminded every person who had come here chasing something gold, cattle land, a fresh start, a forgetting that this country had no interest in their plans. There were 312 people in Harlan Creek in October of 1883, and approximately 290 of them had come from somewhere else, fleeing something or seeking something, and those 2 categories overlapped considerably. There was a main street with 6 buildings, a church whose steeple leaned 2 degrees west as though listening for something out on the mesa, a livery stable run by a Mexican man named Demetrio Cruz who had been in the valley longer than the town itself, and a general store owned by the Fitch family, who were from Ohio and made no apologies about it. There was the sheriff's office, which doubled as the telegraph station, and there was the Rattlesnake Saloon, which despite its alarming name served the best coffee between Pueblo and the New Mexico border, a fact the proprietress, a woman named Lottie Marsh, cited with considerable pride. And there was, on the western edge of town, the road that led out toward the Underwood Ranch, or what had been presented as the Underwood Ranch. Theodora had arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday in September of 1882, stepping off a stagecoach with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a copy of Middlemarch she had read 4 times, and a marriage certificate signed in Springfield, Illinois, 2 weeks prior. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned under her hat with perhaps more aggression than elegance, green eyes that her mother had described as sharp and her father had described as trouble, and a jaw that people frequently interpreted as stubbornness, but which was, more accurately, the structural result of keeping her opinions behind her teeth for the entirety of a childhood in which opinions had not been welcomed. Her husband, Gerald Underwood, had been at the stage to meet her. He was 41 years old, which was within the acceptable range of age difference for a woman in her circumstances. She had known women in Springfield who had married men 20 years their senior and called it practical, and she had nodded along with them while privately thinking that practical was a word people used when they meant resigned. Gerald had been handsome enough, broad-shouldered, with an easy laugh that filled rooms quickly. He had written her 47 letters over the course of a 4-month correspondence arranged through a matrimonial agency in Chicago, and in those letters he had described a ranch of 240 acres on good grass, a house with a parlor and a proper kitchen, a well that did not run dry in August, and a view of the mountains that he claimed made every morning feel like a gift. He had not lied about the view. The mountains were, genuinely, extraordinary. Everything else had been constructed from ambition and wishful thinking, and it turned out outright fraud. Gerald Underwood had come to Colorado in 1879 with a small inheritance from an uncle, a great deal of optimism, and a talent for convincing people that he was more substantial than he was. He had filed on 160 acres under the Homestead Act, legitimate enough. But the additional 80 acres he claimed to own along the creek bottom, the acres with the water rights that made the whole operation viable, belonged legally to a man named Clement Doyle, who had filed the original claim in 1877 and had never formally relinquished it. Doyle had gone east in 1880, and everyone in the valley had assumed he was gone for good. But assuming a man is gone and having legal title to his land are two different things, as any attorney could tell you. Theodora did not know any of this when she arrived. Gerald was charming and the land was beautiful, and there were 2 other women within riding distance who had come out the same way she had, and they exchanged visits and recipes, and the particular comfort of women who are building something new and pretending their doubts are just weather. The first year was hard in the way that first years on the frontier were always hard. The roof over the parlor leaked when it rained, which was not often enough to be merely inconvenient and too often to be manageable. The kitchen stove had a cracked firebox that sent smoke into the room every time the wind shifted, and the wind, as previously noted, had opinions. They lost 6 head of cattle to a blizzard in January. Gerald worked hard, she would give him that, and some evenings he sat with her on the porch and pointed at the mountains and seemed genuinely moved by the life he was attempting to make. And she thought, on those evenings, that perhaps she had made the right choice after all. She did not learn about the hidden debt until the spring of 1883, when a letter arrived from a law firm in Denver addressed to Gerald, which he left on the table and which she read not out of nosiness, but because the return address included the word foreclosure, and she believed a wife had the right to understand what words like that meant for her household. She confronted him that evening. He deflected beautifully. He was, when pressed, a man of extraordinary deflection. The debt was manageable, he said. There had been a business arrangement in his past that was being resolved. She did not need to concern herself with the details. He had everything in hand. She should not worry. She worried. She began quietly to ask questions of the people in town. Not dramatic questions, not accusatory ones, but the patient, methodical questions of a woman who had grown up watching her father lose their family's savings to a man with a similar talent for reassurance, and who had promised herself at 17 that she would never be caught unaware again. What she had learned by July was unsettling. What she learned in August was worse. And what she had not yet known, the thing that the letter in her shaking hands confirmed on that October night in the sheriff's office, was that the 80 Creek Bottom acres, the acres the entire operation depended on for water, had been formally reclaimed by Clement Doyle's estate in August of 1883, and Gerald Underwood had known it, and had not told her, and had died on the 14th of October when the horse he was riding spooked at a rattlesnake on the Carpenter Ridge Trail, and threw him against a limestone outcropping, with the kind of finality that left no room for conversation. He had died with his secrets intact. She had found the letter in his jacket pocket during the laying out, which was how she had come to be standing against the wall of the sheriff's office at 9 o'clock in the evening with a lantern burning down and a stranger sitting in a chair 3 feet away from her, looking at nothing, asking nothing, simply staying. Andrew Walden had come to Harlan Creek 6 months before Theodora. He was 30 years old, she would learn this later, and he had come from Texas by way of New Mexico, which was a direction most men traveled in reverse, and the reason he had traveled it the other way around was something he kept to himself for a considerable time. He had a small stake, 60 acres on the north side of Carpenter Ridge, grass that was thinner than he would have liked but reliably there, and a knack with horses that had earned him a quiet reputation in the valley before he had spoken more than 50 words to most of the people in it. He was not a social man. He was not unfriendly. There was a difference, and Harlan Creek had taken several months to figure out what that difference was in his specific case. He came to town on Saturdays, got what he needed from the Fitch store, drank 1 coffee at Lottie's, spoke when spoken to, and went back up the Ridge Road without lingering. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble beyond the occasional hand of cards with the deputy, a young man named Peters, who lost with good humor. He was civil to everyone and intimate with no one. He had known Gerald Underwood the way everyone in a small valley knew everyone else nodded at him, helped pull his wagon out of a mud hole in the spring thaw, exchanged weather opinions twice. He had formed no strong impression of the man in either direction. He had formed an impression of Theodora Underwood the first time he saw her in the Fitch store in October of 1882, 1 month after her arrival, when she was trying to explain to Elias Fitch that the bolt of muslin she required was not the same weight as the bolt of muslin he was attempting to sell her, and she was doing so with the kind of precise, unraised voice clarity that suggested she had made this same correction 3 times already and was prepared to make it a 4th. Fitch, who was not a bad man but was constitutionally resistant to being corrected by women, had been red-faced and blustering. Theodora had been perfectly calm. She had won. Andrew had bought his flour and left without introducing himself, but he had thought about that interaction more than once in the months that followed. In the abstract, non-committal way, a man thinks about a thing that caught his attention before he has decided what to do with the attention. She was married. He was not the kind of man who forgot that. But Gerald Underwood died on the 14th of October, 1883, and by the evening of the 16th, the evening that matters, the valley had shifted in the way that small places shift when something large and irreversible happens inside them. Theodora had not slept since the morning she found her husband's body. She had received condolences with a straight spine and had organized the burial with efficiency and had not cried in front of anyone, and the people of Harlan Creek had interpreted this variously as strength, coldness, shock, or suspicion, depending on their own natures. She had found the letter in Gerald's jacket. She had read it twice. She had walked to the sheriff's office because Sheriff Brody was also the closest thing Harlan Creek had to a legal authority, and she needed someone to tell her what it meant for the deed to her land. Sheriff Brody had told her, as gently as he was capable of, which was not very gently, that it meant the 80 Creek Bottom acres would revert to Doyle's estate, which was administered by a law firm in Denver, and that without the water rights attached to those acres, the remaining 160 homestead acres were not viable as a cattle operation because the only year-round water source on the original parcel was a seasonal creek that went dry by July. She could file papers contesting the claim, he said, but it would take money she probably did not have and time that the approaching winter would not give her. She had thanked him with the same precise calm she used at the Fitch counter, and he had left to make his evening rounds, and she had remained in the office because she had nowhere to go that felt like the right direction, and the cold coming off the wall felt, strangely, more real than anything else available to her at that moment. That was when Andrew Walden came in. He had seen her light through the window. He had intended only to pass by. He had business with Peters about a stray animal report. But the light through the window had shown him her profile against the wall, and something in the angle of her, the way she was holding herself together with what appeared to be the last physical resources available to her, had stopped him at the door. He came in. He sat down. He did not speak. She stared at him for a long time. "If you're here to tell me you're sorry," she said finally, "I am going to ask you to leave." "I'm not here for that," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, not the performance of calm that some men produced, but actual calm, the kind built by being alone a great deal with difficult things. "Then what are you here for?" she said. He considered this honestly, which she could see on his face. "I don't entirely know," he said. "I saw your light." It was such a simple, truthful answer that she did not know what to do with it. She had been prepared for condolence, for advice, for the well-meaning intrusion of community that this valley specialized in. She had not been prepared for a man who would say, plainly and without decoration, that he had seen her light and come toward it without a prepared reason. She looked back at the letter in her hands. "He forged the deed," she said, "not to him particularly, to the room, to the wall, to the air between herself and the confirmation she had been dreading." Andrew said nothing. Not the homestead claim, that was real, but the Creek acres, he had no right to them. He knew when he wrote to the agency, when he wrote to me, when he told me about the land, he already knew. He'd known for 2 years. The lantern on the windowsill sputtered as the wick burned lower, and the light in the room grew amber and close. "I left my whole life," she said, and her voice did not shake, which cost her considerably. "I left a position at a school. I left my sister. I came out here because he described a future, and I was 26 years old and I thought—" She stopped. The thing she had thought was too private to say to a stranger, and yet she had already said more to this man in 3 minutes than she had said to anyone in the valley in 14 months, and she could not quite explain why. Andrew Walden was looking at the lantern. His elbows were on his knees. His hat was in his hands. He was not watching her bleed, but he was present for it, which was different. "He did not ask you to come here honestly," Andrew said. "That is his failure, not yours." "I am the one who has to live with the consequence," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's true. That's not fair, and it's true." She looked at him then fully. She had seen him before in town, but she had been a married woman and he had been a stranger, and she had not looked directly. Now she looked. He was weathered not in a ragged way but in the way of something tested and still standing. His eyes, when they met hers, did not flinch or slide away or perform sympathy. They just looked back. "My name is Andrew Walden," he said. "I have the North 60 on Carpenter Ridge." "I know who you are," she said. "You helped pull my husband's wagon out of the mud in March." Something moved across his face at the mention of Gerald, small and complicated, and she noted it but could not read it yet. "I did," he said. "Theodora Underwood," she said, though she did not reach a hand out, and he did not reach one toward her, and somehow that was correct. The lantern burned. Outside, the wind came through the gap between the ridges, and she could hear the cottonwood in the yard rattling its remaining leaves against the dark. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her back still against the planks, the letter still in her hands, and she was too exhausted to care about the impropriety of it. Andrew Walden did not comment on it. He shifted in his chair, adjusted his elbows on his knees, and stayed where he was. For a long time neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. That was the thing she would remember in the months that followed when she thought about that night. It was not a silence that needed to be filled or managed or survived. It was a silence that held them both, and she had not known that was something silence could do. "What will you do?" he asked eventually. "I don't know yet," she said. "I need to get through tonight first." He nodded as though this was a completely reasonable position, which she appreciated enormously. She told him more over the next hour. Not all of it. She was not built for complete unburdening to a stranger. even a stranger of this quality but pieces. The school in Springfield she had left. Her sister, Eleanor, who had thought the whole enterprise was a terrible idea from the start, and who had held her tongue with visible effort at the wedding. The 47 letters that had painted a picture so vivid she had believed every stroke of it. The way she had told herself during the first hard months that all new things were hard and that she was simply adjusting. Andrew listened. He asked one or two questions, small, precise ones, the questions of a man who was genuinely following the thread rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He did not offer solutions. He did not tell her it would be all right. He did not say everything happened for a reason, which she had been hearing from various Harlan Creek residents all day, and which she had begun to find almost intolerable. He just listened. And when she finished a particular difficult piece of the telling, he would sit with it for a moment before the conversation moved, as though the thing she said deserved a moment's wait before being replaced by the next thing. The lantern burned lower. She asked him at some point what he did in the evenings. It was an odd question, she knew, but odd questions were coming naturally to her that night, stripped as she was of her usual careful filtering. He thought about it. "I read mostly," he said, "when there's enough light." "What do you read?" "Whatever I can get from the Fitches. They have a lending shelf in the back. Mostly newspapers and a few novels. Last month I read something by Mr. Hardy." "Far from the madding crowd," she said. He looked at her with something that was almost surprise. "Yes. I've read it 3 times," she said. "The ending is better than the middle sections deserve." He was quiet a moment. "Then I thought the same thing." It was such an ordinary thing to agree about. In the middle of the most wreckage-strewn night of her life, she had found a stranger in a sheriff's office who had read the same Thomas Hardy novel and arrived at the same opinion of it. And she was so surprised by the small, ordinary comfort of it that she felt something behind her eyes that had not been there through the entire terrible day. She did not cry, but it was close. "I have to figure out the land," she said, returning to it, because returning to it was more manageable than going near the Thomas Hardy feeling. "There may be options," Andrew said carefully, not offering, not pushing, just indicating that the map had not been fully surveyed. "Sheriff Brody says contesting the claim will cost more than I have and take more time than the winter will allow." "Brody knows the law to a point," Andrew said. "He doesn't know everything about everything." She looked at him. "And you do." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shape of one. "Not everything, but I know someone in Pueblo who handled a similar situation 2 years ago. A homesteader whose neighbor had an overlapping claim. There's a process under the land office that's different from a court contest. It takes less time and less money if the circumstances are right." She was quiet, thinking about this. "I'm not telling you it will work," he said. "I'm telling you it might be worth knowing about." "Why are you telling me?" she said, not unkindly but directly. He looked at the lantern. "Because you're in a difficult situation through no fault of your own, and someone should tell you what they know." She studied him for a long moment. There were men in the world, she had met several, who offered help as a transaction, the terms of which were settled later when you were already obligated. She had learned to read this in the way that women who have been betrayed once or twice learn to read it, the slight lean forward, the particular quality of the generosity, the expectation living beneath the surface of the kindness like water under ice. She did not read that in Andrew Walden. She read something more complicated and, she thought, more honest. She read a man who had also, at some point, sat in a room with a terrible thing and had no one simply stay. She did not say this. She was not ready to say it, but she filed it away with the Thomas Hardy observation. The lantern burned down to its last inch of oil. "You should probably go," she said. Not because she wanted him to, but because it was nearly 11 o'clock at night and she was a widow in a sheriff's office, and at some point the world's opinion of her circumstances mattered for practical reasons, even if she personally found the world's opinion exhausting. He stood, put his hat on, stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary for the act of standing. "Mrs. Underwood," he said. "Theodora," she said. She was not sure why she said it. He nodded. "Theodora." If you want the name of the land agent in Pueblo, I'll bring it to you." "Thank you," she said. He went to the door, turned back once briefly. "I'm sorry," he said. And before she could tell him she had asked him not to say that, he added, "Not for your loss, for the dishonesty. A person deserves better than that." She sat with that for a moment. "Yes," she said. "They do." He left. The lantern sputtered twice and went out, and she sat in the dark for another quarter of an hour, and the dark was more bearable than she had expected it to be. The following 3 weeks were the hardest of Theodora Underwood's considerable catalogue of hard periods. She had a ranch to maintain, cattle to feed, a hand named Josiah, a quiet man of 52 who had worked for Gerald and was loyal more to the animals than to any particular employer, and no clear picture of what her future held. She received 3 separate proposals, informal and in 2 cases barely disguised as concern for her welfare, from men in the valley who had calculated that a widow on 160 acres, even problematic acres, was an opportunity. She declined them all with the same serene precision she used at the Fitch counter when the muslin was wrong. She did not see Andrew Walden the day after, or the day after that. On the 5th day following the night in the sheriff's office, she was in the yard splitting kindling. She had sent Josiah to town for grain when she heard a horse on the road and looked up to see him coming down from the ridge at a walk. He tied the horse to the fence post and walked across the yard and handed her a folded piece of paper without preamble. "That's the agent's name in Pueblo," he said. "And what to ask for specifically. It's called a conflicting entry proceeding. You'll need to file within 60 days of your husband's death, and you'll need a witness to the original filing conditions." She took the paper, looked at it. "Where did you get this information?" "I rode to Pueblo yesterday." She looked up from the paper. "You rode to Pueblo?" "It's a day's ride," he said, as though this were a small and unremarkable fact, which it was not. She had $140 in cash, the entirety of what was left after Gerald's debts were settled from the small account the Harlan Creek Bank held in both their names. She had already calculated that she could file the proceeding, if it was as inexpensive as Andrew was suggesting, and still have enough to get through the winter on reduced operations, selling 2 of the cows to cover feed costs for the remaining stock. She looked at the paper again. The handwriting was careful and clear, the handwriting she noted in the observational corner of her mind, of someone who did not write quickly but wrote precisely. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No," he agreed. "Why did you?" He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as a tell for something he was thinking through. "Because I was going to Pueblo anyway," he said, which was not entirely true, and she suspected they both knew it. "Will you come in?" she said. "I have coffee." He hesitated. "I'm not asking anything more of you than coffee," she said. She stopped, tried again. "The days are very quiet," she said. "I am not a woman who needs noise, but there are different kinds of quiet." He understood this. She could see he understood it. He tied his horse more securely and came inside. The house was, despite everything, a good house. Gerald had built it well, whatever his other failures. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and there were curtains that she had made herself from the correct weight of muslin, and a table with 4 chairs, which now felt like an excess of chairs. She made coffee in the blue enamel pot and set 2 cups on the table and sat across from him, and for a few minutes they did not talk about anything difficult at all. He told her about the ride to Pueblo, the way the Huafano Valley looked in October, the cottonwoods gone yellow. A hawk he had watched working a thermal above the pass for nearly 20 minutes without a single wing beat. The land agent's office, which was above a hardware store and smelled powerfully of turpentine, and the agent himself, a man named Burgess who was efficient and matter-of-fact, and had handled 4 similar cases, 2 of which had resolved in favor of the original homesteader. She told him about Springfield. Not the version of Springfield that fit neatly into a polite conversation, but the real version, the cramped house after her father's business failed, the teaching position she had taken at 19 to help her mother, the particular quality of loneliness that came from spending your days surrounded by other people's children, and coming home to a family that was held together by effort and the stubborn love of people who had very few alternatives. She had wanted something of her own. She had wanted a life that was hers to build, not hers to maintain. That was why the letters had worked on her, not just the land or the security, the idea of authorship. Andrew listened with the same quality of attention she had observed in the sheriff's office, the attention that was full and still and did not rush. "Did you always want to come west?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression. That small, complicated thing she had noticed before, the one she could not yet read. "No," he said. She waited. He looked at his coffee cup. "I came from a family with land in Texas. My father's land. It should have been mine after he passed, but he stopped. Started differently. I had a brother, older by 8 years. And there were things my father knew about his character that I did not know or did not want to know. And when my father's will was read, it divided the land differently than anyone had expected, and my brother contested it. And the contest lasted 2 years and cost everything that was not the land itself. And at the end of it, my brother had what remained of the ranch and I had a horse, a bedroll, and about $80. He said this without self-pity, which made it worse to hear. "Your own family," she said. "Blood is not the same as character," he said. She thought about Gerald's 47 letters. "No," she said, "it's not." There was a silence, and in the silence something shifted between them, the shift that happens when two people have traded true things, and the landscape of the conversation changes accordingly. He left before dark. She stood on the porch and watched him ride back up the ridge road, and the mountains behind him were going orange and rose in the last of the October sun, and she thought, there is a man who has also had his inheritance stolen from him, who also came to this valley with less than he was owed, who also rebuilt from a stripped-down place. And he rode a day to Pueblo on her behalf and asked nothing. She thought about that for a long time. She filed the conflicting entry preceding the following week. The agent in Pueblo, the turpentine-smelling Burgess, was exactly as Andrew had described him, and the proceeding cost $38 in filing fees and required a deposition about the original homestead conditions, which she provided clearly and accurately. She found a witness, Dome Trio Cruz from the livery, who had been in the valley since 1875 and had seen Gerald Underwood's original filing and could attest to what it included and did not include. Burgess told her it would take 6 to 8 weeks for the land office in Denver to render a decision. She would not hear before Christmas. She went home and had supper with Josiah and fed the cattle and looked at the mountains through the kitchen window and thought about the particular quality of waiting when the outcome of the wait determines the shape of your entire future. Andrew came by twice more in October. Once to check on whether the filing had gone through. She told him it had and thanked him, and he received the thanks with the same kind of discomfort that genuinely helpful people have with gratitude, as though they feel the gratitude is slightly misdirected, and once for a reason that was less clearly practical, which neither of them addressed directly. That second visit, he brought her a newspaper from Pueblo 3 weeks old, but she was behind on the news and a novel he had found in the lending shelf at Fitch's. Mrs. Gaskell. She had read it but told him she would read it again, which was true, because she would read almost anything by Mrs. Gaskell any number of times. They talked about books for an hour and a half. She had not talked about books in 14 months. Not really. Not in the way that felt like actually thinking rather than performing sociability. She had not known she missed it until she was doing it again, and the return of something you have been pretending you did not miss is its own specific variety of joy and pain together. November came in cold. The first real snow fell on the 3rd, blanketing the valley overnight and transforming it into the white, still version of itself that she had not yet experienced, having arrived in September and having spent the intervening winter in the practical emergency of first-year survival. Now she stood on the porch in the morning and looked at the white and the blue sky above it and the dark ridge of the mountains against the sky, And she felt the kind of beauty that gets into you when you are standing in the right place and the conditions are correct. The beauty that bypasses thought entirely and lands somewhere more fundamental. She admitted to herself on the porch that morning, genuinely uncertain whether she was in love with this man or whether she was simply a woman in a very extreme situation who was attaching significance to the first person who had treated her with complete honesty. She was also aware that these two things were not necessarily as different as the cautionary part of her brain wanted them to be. She saw him at the Saturday market in November, the informal gathering outside the general store where people traded goods and caught up on Valley news, and their conversation was easy in the way that conversations become easy when two people have already said true things to each other. Lottie Marsh watched them from behind her coffee counter with the expression of a woman who was updating her running inventory of the Valley's social developments. "That's the Walden man," Lottie said to her friend, a stout Welsh woman named Mrs. Price, when Theodora went inside for coffee. "He never talks to anyone like that." "Like what?" said Mrs. Price. "Like he means it," said Lottie. Theodora did not hear this conversation. She was outside and Andrew was pointing at the ridge and saying something about the way the snow had settled on the north-facing slope compared to the south, which told you something about the winter ahead, and she was listening, and both of them were pretending with decreasing conviction that they were simply neighbors. In December, Josiah's brother in New Mexico fell ill, and Josiah asked permission to go south for the winter. She gave it, of course. He was not a man she could hold. He left her with a carefully organized barn, a specific set of instructions about the cattle, and the observation that the Walden man from the ridge had been watching the road to her place, the way a dog watches a gate when he knows someone's coming home, which Josiah offered without further comment, and with the absolute, infuriating neutrality of a man who felt he had said exactly what was necessary. She was alone on the ranch through the first real cold of December, and she managed it. She was not a woman who failed to manage things, but it was isolating in a way that surprised her. Not the physical isolation which she had expected and prepared for. The emotional isolation. The evenings were very long and the books were not always sufficient, and she found herself, on certain nights, listening to the wind in the cottonwoods and thinking about the night in the sheriff's office, the amber light, the man in the chair who had asked nothing and given her the only thing she had actually needed. He came on the 10th of December with a load of firewood. He had cut it on his own property. She could see the ridge timber and the grain of it, and he stacked it against the side of the house without asking, and then came to the kitchen door and knocked. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "You keep doing things you don't have to do," she said. He looked at her, and this time there was something in the look that was not the careful, neutral presence he had offered in the sheriff's office, something more direct and more uncertain, the particular uncertainty of a man who has been keeping something back and is becoming less sure that keeping it back serves anyone. "I suppose I do," he said. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I have soup on." They had supper together, which was the first time, and it was different from the coffee visits in a way that they both felt and neither named. There was something domestic about soup at a kitchen table in the winter, something that reached forward and backward in time at once, toward the future and toward some imagined long past, and they were both aware of it and careful around it the way you are careful around something that matters. He told her more about Texas. She told him about Alina, her sister, who had written her a letter in November that was warm and worried in equal measure, and had asked twice when Theodora planned to come back east, and whether she was safe, and whether she was eating properly, which was Alina's way of asking everything she did not know how to ask directly. "Will you go back?" Andrew asked. She thought about it, really thought about it, not the polite version but the real one. "No," she said finally, "I don't think so. I came here for a reason that turned out to be false, but the reason behind the reason was real. I wanted something I'd built. I wanted land I'd broken my back for and sky that was mine to look at. That's still true regardless of what Gerald told me or didn't tell me. He was quiet for a moment. That's a strong thing to know about yourself. What about you? She said. Are you here for good? He looked at the table, then at her. I am now, he said simply. She held that, said nothing. Let it be what it was. After supper, he helped her wash the dishes, which no man had ever done in her presence without being asked, and the simple ordinariness of it, standing at the wash basin together, the cold pressing at the windows, the lamplight warm on the walls, felt like an act of extraordinary intimacy for reasons she could not entirely articulate. He left before 9. At the door he turned, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway with the lamplight behind her, and he looked at her with that direct, uncertain expression again. Theodora, he said. Andrew, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name aloud, and they both noticed. He put his hat on. He went out into the cold. She stood in the doorway until she could not hear his horse on the road any more, and then she went inside and sat by the stove and put her hands around a warm cup and thought, I am in a great deal of trouble. Not the legal kind. The other kind. The land office decision came in the last week of December, delivered by the Harlan Creek post on a Wednesday morning when the sky was the pale flat white of a serious storm building to the north. Theodora stood by the fence and read it once, put it in her pocket, and stood for a while looking at the mountains. The decision was in her favor. The conflicting entry proceeding had established that Gerald Underwood's claim to the Creek Bottom acres had not been legally supported at the time of filing, and that those acres properly belonged to the Doyle estate. However, and this was the critical clause, because the Doyle estate had been in abeyance for 3 years with no improvements made, and because Theodora Underwood had filed a claim to those acres under her own name as a surviving homestead claimant with documented improvements since 1882, the land office was prepared to recognize her claim to 60 of the disputed 80 acres, specifically the 40 acres nearest the main creek and the 20 acres of the bottom meadow. She did not get everything, but she got the water. With the water she had the ranch. She sat down in the snow in her yard, just sat down, right in the snow, and put her face in her hands. The storm arrived that evening and kept her inside for 2 days. When the road cleared on the second day, she saddled her horse and rode up the ridge road to Andrew Walden's 60 acres. She had never been there. She had not thought about the asymmetry before, the fact that he had been to her place a dozen times and she had never been to his. But now she rode up the road and found the small, neat property on the north slope that was exactly what he had described. Thin grass, a good house, smaller than hers but solid, a well-built corral, and 3 horses that watched her arrival with interest. He came out of the house before she reached the gate. She held up the land office letter. He crossed the yard and took it and read it and looked up at her on her horse with an expression that was open and glad and more unguarded than she had seen on him yet, and she thought, there it is. There is the face underneath the careful one. 60 acres, she said, and the water. The water is everything, he said. Yes, she said, it is. He was still holding the letter. She was still on her horse. The snow on the north slope was deep and blue in the shadow of the ridge, and the sky above was the flat, brilliant blue that follows a hard storm, and she thought, there is no cautious way to say this. There is only saying it. I want to tell you something, she said. He looked up at her. On the night in the sheriff's office, she said, I did not want comfort from anyone. I was so tired of being managed and explained to and talked at. I was in the worst night of my life, and I did not want any of it fixed or diminished or dressed up in good intentions. She took a breath. But you sat with me until the lantern burned out. You didn't try to fix it. You didn't try to manage it. You just stayed. And it was the only thing that actually helped. She paused. I have not stopped thinking about that, or about you. He stood in the snow with the letter in his hand and looked at her for a long moment. I rode a day to Pueblo, he said. For a woman I'd spoken 40 words to. I have been cutting firewood for your property for 3 weeks. I had supper with you and washed your dishes, and I have been lying to myself about why. She felt something loosen in her chest. Why? She said. Because you are honest, he said, and you are strong in a way that doesn't ask you to be less of yourself, and because you talked about Thomas Hardy and the ending being better than the middle deserved, and I thought, there is a person who sees things clearly. She got down from her horse. She walked across the snow to the gate and he met her there, and she looked up at him. He was not much taller than her but enough, and she said, I am a widow with a land dispute and a complicated past, and I am not certain I know how to be in love without being careful about it. I'm a man with 60 acres and a history of being robbed by people who should have done better, he said. I do not need you to be anything but what you are. She kissed him. She had not decided to do it before she did it, or perhaps she had decided long before and had not acknowledged the decision. And it was the kind of kiss that has been waiting a while to happen, quiet at first and then not quiet, warm and certain, and as cold at the edges as the December air around them. He put his hands on either side of her face, gently, the way you hold something you have been frightened of losing before you had a reason to be frightened. Theodora, he said, against her forehead. I know, she said. They stood there in the snow on the north side of Carpenter Ridge, in the Cimarron Valley in December of 1883, and the horses watched them with the placid indifference of animals who have seen everything and regard almost none of it as noteworthy. They did not rush what came next. She was not built for rushing, and neither was he. The winter was long and the valley was close, and they were both people who had been hurt by speed and certainty before, who had trusted too quickly and paid the cost, and there was a particular careful joy in taking the time. They were not teenagers. They were adults who had come to each other through damage and were determined to build something that held. He came to supper twice a week through January. She came to his place on Saturdays and helped with the accounts, because she was better with figures than he was, a fact he acknowledged without embarrassment, and she offered without condescension. They rode the property together and talked about the spring, and what the cattle situation looked like, and what needed to be done with the creek when the thaw came. And all of these conversations were also about other things simultaneously, about the way their lives might overlap, about the shape of a future that included both of them. In February, on a Sunday when the snow was still deep, but the angle of the light had changed just enough to promise that winter was finite, she was sitting at his kitchen table going over his accounts. The 60 acres was genuinely thin, and he had a plan to supplement it with horse training for the valley's ranchers, which was the right use of his particular talent. And he set a cup of coffee in front of her and said, without sitting down, I want to ask you something. She looked up. He was standing by the stove with his own cup, and he was doing the hat-turning gesture, except there was no hat in his hands, so he was doing the motion without the object, which was either endearing or slightly comic or both. I want to ask you to marry me, he said, but I want to be careful about how I do it because the last time someone asked you that, they did it by lying to you, and I will not do it that way. So I am going to tell you everything first. She put her pen down. He told her everything. The full version of the Texas story, not the abbreviated one she'd heard, but the complete version, including the specific nature of his brother's character, the 2-year legal battle, the precise inventory of what it had cost him and how he had rebuilt. He told her about New Mexico, where he had worked for 2 years on a cattle operation before coming north, and the things he had seen there, including the treatment of Mexican workers and the Apache people being pushed further from their traditional lands, injustices that had troubled him deeply, and that he had not been powerful enough to remedy, but which he had refused to profit from, a decision that had cost him a foreman position he had otherwise earned. He told her his finances in specific numbers, not dressed up or softened, because she deserved to know exactly what she was considering. He told her he had 60 acres and a gift with horses and a decent stubbornness and an absolute non-negotiable commitment to honesty, particularly with people he loved. I love you, he said. I have been aware of it since sometime in November, when you told me you came here for the authorship of your own life, and I thought I had never heard anyone describe exactly what I wanted so precisely. She was quiet for a long moment. "I love you too," she said. "I have been aware of it since some time before November, but I was telling myself it was gratitude and circumstance, and I have been arguing with myself about it ever since." "And," he said. "And I lost the argument," she said. He sat down across from her and set both his hands flat on the table and looked at her with that unguarded face, the one underneath the careful one. "Theodora Underwood," he said, "will you marry me? Not for the land, you have the land. Not for security, you are managing your own security. Because you are the most honest and most strong and most surprising person I have encountered in this valley or any valley, and I want to spend my life in the same house as you and argue with you about Thomas Hardy and watch you win arguments at the Fitch counter and grow old on this ridge with you." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "On one condition." He waited. "We live in my house," she said. "It's bigger and the kitchen is better," he laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came all the way up from somewhere deep, and she had not heard him laugh like that before, and it was the best sound she had heard in this valley. "On your conditions," he said. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, Andrew Walden, I will marry you." They were married on the second Saturday of March, 1884, in the Leaning Steeple Church, with Sheriff Brodie standing up as a witness, because he was the nearest thing to an authority figure available, and it seemed appropriate to include one, and Lottie Marsh standing on the bride's side because she had appointed herself Theodora's ally from the beginning, and was not going to be argued out of a wedding. Domtrio Cruz came, and the Fitch family came, and 6 other Valley families came, and the general feeling in the church was that this was a correct and good thing that had taken the right amount of time and no more. Theodora wore a dress of deep green wool that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered special from a Denver merchant. Because she had not worn white the first time and saw no reason to set a precedent, she did not intend to maintain. She carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers from the summer previous, because nothing was blooming yet in March, and she preferred something real to something artificial, even if real meant dry. Andrew wore his best coat, which was a dark charcoal wool that fit him better than anything else he owned, and he had made some effort with his hair that she found genuinely charming. When they stood at the front of the church and the minister said the words and she looked at Andrew Walden and he looked at her, she felt, for the first time in her adult life, something she could only describe as arrived. Not rescued, not resolved. Arrived, the particular feeling of being exactly where you chose to be, having chosen it with your whole self and your whole knowledge. She said yes without hesitation, and so did he, and outside the church afterward the valley was muddy with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods were beginning to think about budding, and the sky was the tentative soft blue of early spring, and Lottie had somehow produced a wedding cake, which was inexplicable and wonderful. The spring and summer of 1884 were, by any measure, a good season. Andrew's horse training work brought in steady income from 6 valley ranchers who had heard about his abilities word, traveled in small valleys in the way that water travels downhill, finding every available path. He worked with 2 of the hands that the larger Reardon Ranch had lent out during the slow season, and his reputation grew to the point that a man came all the way from Pueblo in July, asking about a difficult stallion that 3 trainers had already given up on. Theodora ran the cattle operation with a focused efficiency that surprised even Josiah, who returned from New Mexico in April with a smile, and the opinion that she had improved the management of the place considerably from its previous state, which was true, and was not a comment on her, but on Gerald's somewhat optimistic approach to record-keeping. She bought 2 new heifers at the spring market in town, replaced the cracked firebox in the kitchen stove, and began the process of improving the fence line along the creek bottom, which was now firmly hers. They worked side by side in a way that felt natural, not because they had divided the labor along obvious lines, but because they had each assessed what needed doing and moved toward it without ceremony. She knew more about cattle. He knew more about horses. They both knew about land and weather and the specific arithmetic of making a small operation survive in a difficult country, and they combined these things with a fluency that people in the valley noticed and remarked on, usually approvingly. They argued, too. They were both people with strong opinions and the habit of expressing them, and there were evenings when a disagreement about fencing priorities or water allocation or a business decision became more pointed than was strictly comfortable, and they had both, separately and silently, had the same thought in those moments. This is what it is to share your life with someone who actually sees you, not the managed version, the full version, and they were both, separately and silently, grateful for it. In July, she wrote a long letter to her sister Eleanor in Springfield. The first truly honest letter she had written since coming west. The earlier ones had been honest about the facts but not about the feelings, a distinction that Eleanor, who knew her better than anyone, had surely detected. She told Eleanor about Andrew, about the night in the sheriff's office, about the firewood and the Pueblo ride and the December kiss in the snow, about the wedding, which Eleanor had not been present for, a fact that Theodora apologized for without qualification, about the way the morning light came through the kitchen window across the table where they had coffee, and the way he read to her sometimes in the evenings from whatever was on the lending shelf, and the way she was beginning, for the first time in her life, to feel that the authorship she had come west seeking was genuinely hers. Eleanor wrote back in August, a letter that ran to 12 pages and included 3 changes in tone and at least 2 places where she had clearly been crying while writing, and which concluded with the information that she was coming to visit in October. She had already purchased her stagecoach ticket, and she expected to be met at the stage. Theodora read this letter at the kitchen table and laughed for about 3 minutes straight, and Andrew looked up from the accounts and asked what was funny, and she read it to him, and he said that Eleanor sounded exactly like how she had described her, and he was looking forward to meeting her, and he meant both of these things. Eleanor arrived in October, 18 months to the month since Theodora had first stepped off a stage in this valley, and the contrast between those 2 arrivals was not lost on anyone. Eleanor was smaller than Theodora, rounder, with the same green eyes and considerably less jaw, and she arrived with 4 trunks and an opinion about everything she saw, delivered in a warm, rapid voice that filled the stage depot instantly. She stopped when she saw Andrew. She assessed him with the concentrated efficiency of an older sister who has been worried about her younger sibling for 18 months and has arrived prepared to find fault. He met her gaze without flinching. She looked at Theodora. "He'll do," she said. "I know," said Theodora. "I didn't ask your opinion," Eleanor said to Andrew pleasantly. "I was talking to my sister." "I understand," he said. "I'd have done the same." Eleanor decided, apparently on the spot, that she approved of him, and the 3 of them rode back to the ranch in the wagon with Eleanor in the middle asking Andrew questions at a pace and specificity that was somewhere between an interview and an interrogation, and he answered each one honestly and without deflection. And by the time they reached the ranch road he had passed whatever test Eleanor had constructed. Eleanor stayed for 3 weeks, which was 1 week longer than planned, and in those 3 weeks she made herself useful in the way that a woman who has grown up with limited resources makes herself useful. She sewed. She helped with the kitchen garden preparation for winter. She took over the accounts for a week and reorganized them in a way that both Andrew and Theodora had to admit was more efficient, and she talked to Theodora in the evenings with the frank, comprehensive honesty of a sister. The kind that covers everything that has been unsaid in letters. She told Theodora, on one of those evenings when Andrew was in the barn and they were sitting by the stove, that she had been frightened when Theodora had married Gerald. Not just practically frightened, but the deeper kind, the fear of watching someone you love make a decision that looks like hope and might be despair. "And now," said Theodora. Eleanor looked at the fire. "Now I think you have found someone who is genuinely worthy of the kind of person you are, which is a more specific thing than it sounds." Theodora did not cry, because she was not built for it, but she put her arm around her sister, and they sat together by the stove in a silence that was the good kind, the kind built from long familiarity and intact love. And the fire burned quietly, and outside the wind was doing its thing in the cottonwoods. When Alina left, she hugged Andrew at the stage depot in a way that conveyed both genuine affection and a continued willingness to revise downward her opinion if he failed to maintain the standard. And he received this hug with a gravity and gratitude that Alina, getting into the stage, mentioned to Theodora in a rapid whisper was exactly the right response. The autumn of 1884 moved into a winter that was harder than the previous one, deeper snow and a cold that settled into the valley in early November and did not lift. They managed it together, and the managing of it together was different from managing anything alone. Not easier, precisely, but richer. The way a difficult thing is richer when there is someone to turn to at the end of the day and say, "This is what happened today and this is what it cost me, and I am glad you are here." In December, on a Sunday evening when the snow was thick against the windows and the stove was working hard and she was mending by the lamp while he read aloud from a newspaper account of events in Washington that they both found outrageous, she put her mending down and said, without preface, "I am going to have a child." He put the newspaper down. She looked at him and her face was complicated, glad and frightened, and honest in the way that the largest things always made her honest, without armor or qualification. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it and said nothing for a moment, and then said, quietly, "Are you all right?" "I am terrified," she said. "I'm also," she stopped. "I have never wanted something this much and been this frightened of it simultaneously." "That seems correct," he said. "Does it seem right to you?" she said. "I need to know that it seems right to you." He looked at her with the unguarded face full and clear. "It is the best thing I have heard since you said yes in March," he said. She gripped his hand. "I will need you to be present for it," she said. "In the way you were present in the sheriff's office, not fixing it, just staying." "I will stay for every moment of it," he said. "All of it, whatever comes." She believed him. Which was, she thought, the most significant thing she had received from another person in her entire adult life. The ability to believe them. Spring came late to the valley in 1885, the snow hanging on into April, but when it finally released its grip the land came up green and extravagant, as though making up for the lateness, and the creek ran full and clear over the bottom meadow that was now, uncontestably, hers. The cattle were healthy. The horse training work had expanded to 3 neighboring counties. They had hired a young hand named Will, 16 years old and from a struggling homestead family 2 valleys over, who slept in the small room off the barn and was eager and capable, and who Andrew was quietly teaching the horsework, because the boy had the same instinct for it. Theodora ran the ranch through April and most of May, because she was not built for sitting down when there was work to be done, and Andrew watched her with a combination of admiration and concern that she found equally touching and slightly maddening. "I am going to have this child," she told him in May, when he suggested for the 3rd time that perhaps she did not need to personally dig the new post holes along the creek bottom, "the same way I have done everything else in my life, which is by continuing to move forward until I physically cannot." "I know," he said. "Then stop looking at me like that." "I will try," he said, and did not succeed. Their son was born on the 8th of June, 1885, in the same bedroom where the morning light came through the window across the table. Mrs. Price, the stout Welsh woman, came and served as midwife, which was the role she had served for half the valley's children, and she was brisk and capable and entirely unimpressed by any distress that did not require immediate medical attention. Theodora was in labor for 11 hours, and she did not make it easy on anyone in the room, including herself, but she was, as she had promised, in motion until she physically could not be. And when it was over and Mrs. Price placed the child in her arms, she looked at him with an expression that Andrew, standing in the doorway because Mrs. Price had restricted him to the doorway for the final hour, had never seen on her face before and which went through him like a clean, cold strike of something he had no word for. The child was small and furiously red and had already what appeared to be a jaw. "He looks like you," Andrew said, coming to the bedside. "I noticed," she said, and her voice was rough and exhausted and also the most contented he had ever heard it. "What shall we name him?" She had been thinking about this for months. She had a list, a real one, written on the back of an old land filing document with careful handwriting. She had discussed names with Alina by letter and with Andrew in the evenings and had maintained a deep private conviction about the right name without quite saying it yet. "James," she said, "for no one in particular, just because it is a good name and it suits him." Andrew looked at the child. "James Walden," he said. "James Henry Walden," she said. "Henry for your father." He was very still for a moment. "He did not do right by you," she said. "But he was your father and this is your son, and I think the name carries more good than harm." Andrew sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife, and the June light coming through the window, and he did not try to say anything for a while, which was the right choice. James Henry Walden was a child of considerable opinions from very early on, which surprised no one who had met his parents. He had his mother's jaw and his father's eyes, and the particular combination of stubbornness and patience that suggested he was going to be effective at whatever he decided to do. He grew up knowing both the cattle work and the horse work, moving between them with the easy fluency of a child raised where everything is real and consequential. He learned to read early because books were present and valued, and his first full sentence at 18 months was apparently the word "again," addressed to his mother at the end of a picture book, which she took as a good sign. The valley changed around them in the years that followed, as valleys do. New families came in. A school opened in 1886, a proper one with a hired teacher from Kansas, and Theodora was on the committee that established it, which was a source of satisfaction that connected neatly back to the school she had left in Springfield. She wrote to Alina about it. Alina had, by 1886, married a man in Springfield, a schoolteacher of her own, and her letters were warm and full and regular. The horse training operation Andrew had built expanded in ways neither of them had fully predicted. By 1887, he had a reputation that extended to ranches 2 days' ride away, and he had trained Will to the point where the boy, now 20, was capable of handling most of the routine work independently. Will stayed on, eventually getting his own claim on a small piece of the valley south of town, and Andrew had helped him file it properly, the way you help someone when you know what it is to have no one help you. In the summer of 1887, a man came to the ranch who introduced himself as Nathan Doyle, nephew of the late Clement Doyle, come from Missouri to settle the estate and review its assets. Theodora received him on the porch with the same composed precision she had always brought to difficult conversations, and Andrew stood by the corral with his arms folded and watched the road. Nathan Doyle was a mild-mannered man of 35 who looked at the property, and at the land office records she produced and said, without evident resentment, that the decision appeared sound, and he had no intention of contesting it. He was more interested, he said, in selling the remaining 20 acres of the original Doyle claim, the 20 she had not been awarded, because he had no use for land in Colorado and needed the cash. She bought those 20 acres for $40. They were the 20 acres along the southern fence line, not particularly valuable, but they made the property clean and whole, and there was a particular satisfaction in owning a thing without edges that someone else had a claim to. She told Andrew about it that evening at the kitchen table where they were having coffee, and he looked at the deed she had spread on the table and traced its border with his finger and said, 240 acres. Plus your 60, she said. He looked up. I have been thinking, she said, that there is no practical reason for us to be filing on 2 separate parcels at this point. He was quiet. I am not suggesting that you hand over your land to me, she said. I am suggesting we consolidate the claims into one property with both our names on it, which is what a marriage actually means when both people are serious about it. He looked at her for a long moment. You want to combine the deeds? I want 300 acres with both our names on it, she said. A shared thing, not mine, not yours, ours. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Let's file it Monday, he said. James was 2 years old and had his father's hat, which he wore at a serious angle, when they rode into town Monday morning to file the combined claim, and he sat between them on the wagon seat with the gravity of someone who understood the significance of the occasion, which he certainly did not. But he was a child who wore gravity naturally, and it was both touching and comic. The combined deed was filed under Walden property, Carpenter Ridge, Harlan Creek, Huerfano County, Colorado, in the names of Andrew James Walden and Theodora Claire Walden, née Underwood, and it was the most satisfying document she had ever signed. The autumn of 1887 was the kind of autumn that the valley occasionally produced, the kind that made you understand why people stayed in difficult places, the aspen on the high ridge going gold against the dark timber, the air sharp and clean with the coming cold, the mountains showing their first white. She stood on the porch of the house that was now unambiguously hers, fully and legally and completely hers, with 240 cattle on good grass and a husband whose horse was in the corral, and whose voice she could hear from the barn, talking to James, explaining something about the way you approach a nervous animal slowly, with patience from the side, never from behind. She listened to his voice explaining patience to their son and thought about the night in the sheriff's office, the amber light burning down, the paper in her hands. She had not asked for comfort. She had not wanted management or rescue or solutions. She had wanted to be seen and to have someone stay, and this man had done both without being asked, without ceremony, without expectation of return, and she had been rebuilt by it more thoroughly than by anything else in her life, more than the land, more than the legal victory, more than the wedding or the spring cattle or the combined deed. You did not have to earn love by being undemanding of it. That was what she had learned slowly over the 4 years since that night. You did not have to make yourself small and manageable, and easy so that someone would find you worth sitting with. The right person would sit with you while the lantern burned out, and would still be there in the dark, and would ride a day to Pueblo because you needed the information, and would tell you their own damage without varnish, and would name his father's name on your son. She went into the barn. Andrew was crouched beside James, who was sitting in the straw with a not particularly pleased barn cat in his lap, and Andrew was saying something quiet about how you hold an animal that does not want to be held, not gripping, just resting your hands and letting the animal decide, and James was listening with his father's focused expression. She leaned against the barn door. Andrew looked up and saw her, and the unguarded face was there, always available to her now, never hidden, and he smiled. "Come see," he said. "He's almost got it." She came and crouched beside them, the three of them in the straw with the cat and the afternoon light coming through the high barn window, and James looked at her with serious eyes and said, "Mama, patient." "I know," she said. "Your father taught me that." Andrew looked at her sideways with that almost smile. "The cat is deciding," James said. "Yes," she said, "the cat is deciding." They waited together, all three, in the quiet patience of people who have learned that the best things come to those who do not grip, but only rest their hands and allow the moment to be what it is, and the cat considered the situation for a long, dignified moment, and then settled its considerable weight into James's lap with the air of a creature conferring a great honor. James looked at his parents with triumph and complete satisfaction. "There," he said. "There," Andrew agreed. Later that evening, after supper, after James was in bed and the valley was dark and the stars were the extravagant Colorado stars that you could not see from Springfield or anywhere east of the proper West, they sat together on the porch in the cold, sharing the quilt from the back of the kitchen chair, and she leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they did not talk for a long time. "Eleanor is coming in April," she said, eventually. "I know." Her last letter said she might bring her husband. She wants to see the operation. She wants to make sure you're eating properly, he said. She laughed. Yes, that too. The cottonwoods were bare now, rattling their empty branches at the dark, and the wind came through the gap and had its opinions. The mountains were invisible in the night but present, the way large things are present even when you cannot see them. I want another child, she said. I have been thinking about it. He was quiet for a moment. When he said, I don't know, soon, I want James to have someone. So do I, he said. She thought about that. About the brother he had, the brother who had taken what was not his. About what it meant to him to say, I want my son to have someone. We will do it differently, she said. We will teach them both about honesty. About what it costs and what it is worth. James already knows more about patience than most grown men, he said. He learned from watching you with the horses, she said. I have noticed. He learned from watching you with everything else, Andrew said. She turned her head and looked at him in the dark, just the outline of him, the familiar shape of this man who had chosen her and chosen to stay and had never offered her anything she had not needed. I love you, Andrew Walden, she said. I love you, Theodora Walden, he said. And the name she carried now was her choice, and she had never felt a name fit better. He pulled the quilt closer around them, and they stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in, and the stars turned on their long, slow arc above the valley, and the mountains stood in the dark as they had always stood, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the small, bright lives burning at their feet. She did not ask for comfort on that October night in 1883, and he had not offered it. He had simply sat with her until the lantern burned out. And from that unasked-for staying, from that simplest of gifts, they had built 240 acres, one son with a father's hat and a mother's jaw, a horse training operation that was the envy of 3 counties, a combined deed with 2 names on it, and a life that was, by any honest measure, exactly what she had come west to find. Not the life that had been promised in 47 false letters. The life that was genuinely hers. The life she had authored with her own hands on her own terms, alongside the one person who had seen her truly and chosen to stay. In the spring of 1888, their second child arrived, a boy they named Daniel, who had his mother's eyes and a temperament so placid that everyone who met him in the first weeks of his life looked between his parents and then at each other with barely concealed astonishment. James, 3 years old, greeted his brother with the measured interest of a person who has been expecting something and has decided to reserve judgment. He is very small, James said. He will get larger, Theodora said. Does he know about patience? James asked. He is learning, Andrew said. James looked at Daniel with a long, evaluating expression and then apparently decided this was satisfactory. Alina came in May as promised, with her husband Thomas, who was a mild, intelligent man who loved Alina completely, and whose combination of mild intelligence and complete devotion to his wife was, in Theodora's opinion, the ideal configuration. Thomas and Andrew found immediate common ground in a shared interest in practical mechanics. Thomas knew a great deal about machinery, and Andrew was always looking for better ways to manage the property. And they spent 2 days talking about windmill pumps and improved fencing methods with the absorbed enthusiasm of men who have discovered an unexpected equal. Alina held Daniel and looked at James and walked the property and ate supper at the kitchen table 3 nights running and said, on the final evening, that the place was exactly what Theodora had described in her letters, but that she had not fully believed until she saw it, because she had been afraid for a long time that hope was something her sister had to be careful about. And now, Theodora said, same as 4 years ago on the same stove, same question. Alina looked around the kitchen, the good stove with the repaired firebox, the curtains in the right weight muslin, the table where James was drawing something with a stick of charcoal, and Andrew was reading the newspaper aloud to nobody in particular, and Daniel was asleep in the cradle by the window in the late spring light. Now, said Alina, I believe every word of it. The night after Alina and Thomas left, after the boys were in bed, and the house was quiet again, with the different quiet of its own inhabitants rather than the lively noise of guests. Theodora and Andrew sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee, and the lamp burning between them. She looked at the lamp and thought about the lantern in the sheriff's office and the October night and the amber light and the man in the chair who had not asked, had not fixed, had simply stayed, and she thought, the best things in a life are often accidental in their beginning and chosen in their continuation. The choice is where they live. She had chosen this. Every day. Eyes open, full knowledge, the whole complicated truth of it, the thin grass and the difficult winters and the occasional argument about fencing, and the fact that she still had a stronger jaw than her husband and probably always would. She had chosen it the way you choose a thing when you know what choosing costs, when you have been the person who paid the cost of someone else's false choice, and you know the difference between what is true and what is convenient. Andrew Walden looked up from the coffee cup and caught her looking and raised his eyebrows in the expression that meant, "What are you thinking?" "I was thinking," she said, "about a lantern burning out in October." He understood. He always did. He reached across the table and took her hand. Outside, the Cimarron range stood patient in the dark, and the creek ran over the bottom meadow that was hers, and the cottonwoods moved in the wind that had opinions, and the stars were enormous and close over the valley that was home, and the lamp between them burned steadily and bright, and neither of them had any intention of letting it go out.